Good evening, everyone. All our viewers tuning in to ALLATRA TV. Today we are joined by Professor Montano. What might have once seemed like a controversial hypothesis is now raising serious alarms. Sperm quality is steadily declining worldwide, and a growing number of scientists are now openly talking about a true male fertility crisis.
Hello, everyone who's watching us from Italy. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Luigi Montano, a uro-andrologist at the ASL Salerno, head of the Environmental Pathology and Lifestyle Medicine Service in Uro-Andrology at the San Francesco d'Assisi Hospital, coordinator of the ECOFOOD Fertility Research Project, past president of the Italian Society of Human Reproduction, who also holds a Ph.D. in Evolutionary Biology and Ecology. Good evening, Professor. Thank you for joining us. Before we dive into today's topic, which is apparently one of the great challenges of the 21st century, could you tell us a bit about your professional background? What inspired you to become an andrologist and a researcher in the field of fertility?
Actually, my journey began with my clinical work as a uro-andrologist. To be more precise, I am a specialist in urology with advanced training in andrology. So, over time, I started noticing an increase in male reproductive issues, often in seemingly healthy young men. I must say, I am conducting a major research study, especially in areas with high environmental pressure. This has led me to question the root causes, looking beyond individual clinical conditions and instead focusing on the environment, lifestyle factors, and exposure to emerging contaminants such as microplastics. That's exactly how the EcoFood Fertility Project was born. It essentially treats semen as a true biological sentinel for both the environment and a man's general health. Since the reproductive system is incredibly sensitive to environmental stressors, I was driven to really understand the why behind this. That's what led to this in-depth study on the impact that contaminants, particularly micro and nanoplastics, have on fertility. Specifically male fertility, since I'm an andrologist, but female fertility as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor. We know you've published numerous studies on microplastics and their connection to the male reproductive system. Before we delve deeper into fertility, could you briefly explain to our audience what microplastics are? We are all familiar with plastic, but what exactly are microplastics and nanoplastics? What's the difference?
First of all, microplastics are plastic particles that range in size from 1 to 5,000 micrometers. A micrometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. They come from the degradation of larger plastic objects, or they are intentionally manufactured for industrial use, for instance, in cosmetics. Nanoplastics, on the other hand, refer to a much smaller, nanometric scale. A nanometer is 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So these particles are actually smaller than 0.1 micrometers. This difference in size is absolutely crucial, because the smaller the particles, the greater their ability to cross biological barriers, enter our cells, and potentially interfere with fundamental physiological processes.
So here's another question. Why do you think the average person, someone who isn't in the scientific field or actively researching this, should care about these findings regarding micro and nanoplastics?
Well, essentially, it's because we aren't talking about an abstract problem, or one that's just confined to our oceans. Initially, of course, all the focus was on marine life and ocean pollution. But today, these particles have been found in human blood, in placentas, in breast milk, and we've also found them in semen and follicular fluid. In fact, our team was the first to discover the presence of microplastics in human urine, as well as in semen for men and follicular fluid for women. What this means is that every single one of us is being exposed to them to a certain extent on a daily basis. Understanding their effects is about protecting not just our own individual health, but the health of future generations. Because we're talking about substances that are making their way into the very biological material we pass on to our children.
Thank you, Professor. I'd like to ask, what initially led you to suspect that these plastic micro and nanoparticles could be affecting the reproductive system?
Well, for decades now, we've been seeing a steady decline in human fertility, particularly male fertility. At the same time, we've seen toxicological studies emerging that clearly show the damage microplastics cause to reproductive health. Those early studies were done on animals, fish, mice, and they show that the male reproductive system, in particular, is extremely sensitive to environmental pollutants. Through our ECOFOOD fertility research project, we started seeing abnormalities in semen quality, especially in areas with high environmental stress. We were looking at elevated levels of contaminants like phthalates, bisphenols, heavy metals, PCBs, and other substances. Seeing this excess, especially in young men living in highly polluted areas, compared to those in cleaner areas, we figured that emerging contaminants, like microplastics, might be present as well. So, we started investigating the presence of microplastics in these bodily fluids, starting with urine and semen, and eventually, as I mentioned, in follicular fluid.
Excellent. And on that note, we wanted to ask if you could share some of the main findings from your research on micro and nanoplastics.
Yes, we started by publishing an initial study, along with a series of review papers looking at the presence and effects of microplastics on animals and marine life. We looked at the massive scale of microplastic pollution in our oceans, and specifically in certain seas. From there, we started testing for microplastics in urine. In 2023, we published a groundbreaking paper in the international journal Toxics. It was the very first evidence of microplastics in human urine. In that study, using a small sample size of both men and women, we were able to detect the presence of microplastics. After that, we shifted our focus to semen, an area where we have extensive expertise. We have significant sample data, especially from young men across various regions of Italy. We analyzed 10 of those samples, and out of the 10, we found microplastics in 6 of them. We identified 16 plastic fragments from different polymers, including polyethylene, polypropylene, and PVC. More recently, looking at 18 women undergoing assisted reproduction techniques, we detected microplastics in the follicular fluid of 14 of them. We used a different technique for this one, and we found roughly 2,000 particles per milliliter. The presence of microplastics in urine is concerning enough, but finding them in follicular fluid, in direct contact with the eggs, and in semen, in direct contact with the sperm, is obviously a major threat. It's a threat because these substances are right there with our gametes, the very cells that carry and transmit our genetic code, and that is incredibly alarming.
So, would you say the sample analyzed in your studies is somewhat representative of the general population? Or do you think environmental or perhaps lifestyle factors might have influenced the results?
Well, our initial studies were really pioneering, so they naturally involved smaller sample sizes. However, subsequent studies have since been conducted, and they have confirmed the presence of micro and nanoplastics in urine, kidneys, testicles, semen, and, as we discovered later, follicular fluid. While we can't draw absolute conclusions just yet, this is undoubtedly a very strong biological signal. So, it's highly likely that environmental factors like diet, occupational exposure, the use of single-use plastics, and even how we store our food do play a major role in how microplastics accumulate in the body. Basically, it's safe to say that we are all, to some extent, contaminated with microplastics. We initially analyzed these particles in small but meaningful numbers across those 3 specific bodily fluids. And as I mentioned, larger follow-up studies have since validated our findings. On top of that, we've recently received funding from the Ministry of Health for a major study that is currently underway. We're looking at a much larger cohort, over 400 healthy young men from 4 different regions of Italy, to investigate both the presence and the impact of microplastics. We are just starting the biomonitoring phase in these 4 regions to specifically evaluate how microplastics affect sperm quality.
So, when it comes to semen, it's pretty clear. But could you explain to our viewers what follicular fluid is and what you discovered about it in your research?
Well, follicular fluid is the microenvironment that surrounds and nourishes the oocyte during ovarian maturation. So basically, this environment is essential for the development of egg cells. In our research, as I mentioned, we found microplastics in 14 out of 18 women. We also observed, and published this in our paper, a correlation between the concentration of microplastic particles and parameters related to ovarian function. For example, more microplastics correlated with higher levels of FSH, which is basically an indirect indicator of ovarian dysfunction. And this is a finding that deserves serious attention. Following our study, which we published in April 2025, other 2 papers came out that confirmed the presence of microplastics in follicular fluids, and also their initial effects. These studies are ongoing because we need to move forward and understand the actual role of microplastics, which we already know quite a bit about. In the animal kingdom, for example, particularly in fish and mice, the effects are linked to oxidative stress, genomic changes, and other mitochondrial dysfunctions. So these effects are well documented in animal models, as well as in cells.
If I may ask, as a society, we have only recently started looking closely at the issue of microplastics, nanoplastics, and pollution. So I wanted to understand how it's possible for such tiny particles to bypass the body's protective barriers. Does this mean that plastic is becoming an integral part of our bodies? Is it possible that reproductive cells themselves contain microplastics?
Well, if we look at the nanometric scale, meaning billionths of a meter, then absolutely, yes. The smallest particles, especially nanoplastics, can cross cell membranes in addition to biological barriers, which allows them to somehow interfere with the most intimate cellular processes, like endocytosis, and penetrate cells to induce, as I mentioned, mitochondrial and lysosomal alterations, causing direct damage to both nuclear and mitochondrial DNA. Basically, we have, right now, to be honest, we don't have direct proof of nanoplastics being inside the sperm or the oocyte itself, but I believe that is where future studies are headed. I am certain that these micro and nanoplastics, because of their extremely small size, can also find their way inside these cells. And that is deeply, deeply concerning.
What makes these particles potentially toxic? How can they be harmful? I mean, if we touch plastic, nothing happens. But why does it seem to be different at the cellular level?
Well, both in animal models and in cells, it has been shown that the polymers themselves can induce oxidative stress, inflammation, cellular apoptosis, DNA damage, and mitochondrial dysfunction. On top of that, another mechanism is that micro and nanoplastics carry and act as vectors for other notoriously toxic substances, such as phthalates, bisphenols, heavy metals, dioxins, and PFAS, which amplifies the biological damage. Because in addition to the polymer itself, they act as carriers for these other known toxins, making them particularly harmful.
Okay, as we've mentioned, there are numerous studies showing the potential harmful effects of micro and nanoplastics on health and the environment. But one thing that might not be highlighted often, though it is featured in reports released over time on the ALLATRA platform, is that completely stopping plastic production right now is unrealistic. At the same time, recycling itself can actually be a significant source of micro and nanoplastic release. Based on current knowledge, researchers at the ALLATRA Global Research Center propose the hypothesis that the so-called surface charge of nanoplastics might be a key factor of their danger. At the same time, they suggest taking a deeper look into why these particles interact with living systems in such a peculiar way, and whether it's possible to reduce their biological activity. In this regard, how important do you think it is to support this direction of research, along with international cooperation and open data sharing? And what else could be done?
Well, let's put it this way. Surface charge fundamentally affects the particle's ability to interact with cell membranes, proteins, and DNA. So in a way, this is absolutely important and essential to study it further. That said, we need standardized analytical protocols. By the way, it was our research group that collaborated on and successfully completed the first phase of the European project Horizon on micro and nanoplastics. In practice, its goal is to standardize protocols and establish shared databases. This requires strong cooperation among research centers to standardize their methods, making international collaboration key. Beyond that, we need to invest in primary prevention, meaning the reduction of single-use plastics, industrial innovation, and environmental education. And I must stress, stricter regulatory policies as well. This is the path forward, and it's exactly the direction we are heading as a research group.
If I may, I'd like to go back for a moment to the topic of having children. Can these harmful effects be passed on to the embryo after fertilization?
Well, in animals, there is evidence showing that maternal exposure to microplastics can affect fetal development and lead to transgenerational effects in the offspring. This has indeed been proven. In humans, we don't have definitive proof yet. However, the fact that these particles have been found in the placenta and in reproductive fluids, like semen and follicular fluid, makes this possibility a high-priority research topic. So, we absolutely have to investigate this. But since it has already been documented in the animal kingdom, and usually, what is proven in animals eventually turns out to be true for humans as well.
Thank you. We've talked about diagnosing the problem, but what about the solution? Is there any way to detoxify semen or follicular fluid, or does the presence of these particles represent a permanent change to the reproductive systems of both men and women?
Well, you see, there are no specific therapies right now. However, we do have certain approaches, and we've been applying them for quite some time now as the second phase of the ECOFOOD Fertility Research Project, this biomonitoring project on various substances across multiple areas of Italy, the so-called remediation of polluted areas. That is, while we wait for the planet to be decontaminated, while we wait, so to speak, for the remediation of these territories. We are therefore also using the so-called organic Mediterranean diet. That is, foods that are, so to speak, richer in antioxidants, which are prevalent in our Mediterranean diet, meaning primarily plant-based foods, but organic ones. Why? Because they are much richer in phytonutrients, and therefore antioxidants, detoxifiers, and activators of detoxifying enzymes. And of course, they don't contain pesticides, so they themselves are free of these notoriously toxic substances. In this way, they can help counteract the pro-oxidant and pro-inflammatory effects of microplastics and the substances that travel with them, as I mentioned earlier. Naturally, this is about mitigating the impact, meaning we can reduce the effects to some extent. There are also natural substances, like anthocyanins, which have antioxidant and detoxifying properties. So, we can do some things on the detoxification front, but we are talking about detoxifying the consequences, whereas the actual burden of micro and nanoplastics remains. So, the most rational approach is to reduce exposure, limit the use of plastic for food and drinks, avoid, for example, heating food in plastic containers. Instead of plastic, opt for glass and stainless steel. Watch what you eat. Again, stick to fresh foods, and adopt lifestyles that actively combat oxidative stress and inflammation. So, while minimizing the consequences, reduce the use of plastic across virtually all areas.
Of course. So, what is the conclusion in a nutshell? Can we say that micro and nanoplastics are indeed a hidden factor in the global decline of both male and female fertility? What is the overall picture here?
We can say they are certainly a plausible candidate among the many factors involved, because there are indeed so many. But as I mentioned, the global decline in fertility is multifactorial. There are endocrine disruptors, basically chemical pollutants, that interfere with the system, but we also have to consider poor lifestyle choices, sedentary behavior, obesity, stress, and older reproductive age. So, many different factors contribute to the global decline in fertility. However, microplastics certainly fit into this picture as a potential emerging cofactor. I must say, while the issue is getting some attention today, very little is actually being done, and we need to do much more.
Perfect. Professor Montano, thank you so much for your valuable insights, your enthusiasm, your research, and your commitment to this incredibly important topic. Would you like to leave a final message for our audience?
Well, I would say that microplastics are certainly one of the new challenges for global health. We shouldn't cause panic, but we must have a scientific awareness of the problem. Fertility is undoubtedly an early indicator of the health of both humans and the environment. So protecting reproductive health means protecting the future of our species. Research must guide us toward more sustainable choices, both individually and, above all, collectively. I am confident that some important progress is being made. However, let me repeat, we must do a whole lot more.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for being with us, Professor Montano, Irina, and all of our viewers.
Until next time, thank you.
Thank you.